Let's now move back to the packet and do a few examples of percentages and applying a lot of these things I've been talking about. So, and so like also to fill in the blank here, like say for example, I talked a little bit about what it means to like say get a 5% raise. You know, it kind of amounts to a percentage of 105%. It's kind of like I'm going to take 100% and add the growth percent to it. But the same thing can be applied to percent off. Like say I was trying to figure out, um, like let's say I'm getting 10% off of my bill. What does that amount to? Well, in the same way, let's say that like you're eating at a restaurant and this is the original price. You know, just this block is going to represent how much is the bill, like $50, $60, whatever. It doesn't matter what it is. And if I'm getting 10% off, I could think about that as well. I'm going to lose some of that bill is going to be subtracted because it's, you know, I'm getting that lopped off. In this case, let's just call it 10%. But basically, again, the original block, this is kind of the idea, which is where I might refer to this as the percentage is referent to 100. Because if I'm getting a raise of 5%, well, my original salary was the whole was 100%, so my new salary is 100% plus 5%. And if I'm getting 10% off, it's referent to 100, meaning I'm subtracting 10%, meaning that the remaining bill is going to be 90% of the original cost. And again, that's kind of a shortcut. That's what I mean and why this is kind of helpful in terms of the mental math ability. But let's say, for example, we're going to get 20% off. That's what I instantly think of is that's going to be 80% of the original value. Because if I'm getting 20% off, that's basically the part that's free or being subtracted. And so like that's a way I could think about how much is going to be remaining on my check, and then I could figure out my check's value by multiplying it by zero point 0.8. Because if I want to know 80% of my value, I directly multiply, and it's a bit of a shortcut. So let's try to apply what I was talking about to an example. So let's say your restaurant bill is $125, and you're going to get 10% off. What does that amount to? But so, you know, one way of doing this is I could think about 10% off as 90% of the original. And my point is if I just take 90% and multiply by the original bill, we're going to get exactly the reduced cost. So basically 125 times 0.9 for 90% would leave me with $112.50. And notice it's one step and it's way easier. So just to sort of compare to how most people do this, and how I've seen most people teach how you know how we solve this, is well, 10%. I could always start with the 10% and directly multiply into 125 because that's kind of what it means, right? I have a percentage that always multiplies into a value, and 10% of 125 is 1250. And basically, well, that is how much I'm getting off. So I could then take that 125 minus 1250, and that would give me my new bill, $112.50, the answer. But notice how that was a two-step process, right? I apply 10%, then I subtract it. But that's my point about the 90%. It's one step, right? If I just directly multiply by 90%, it skips the middleman or the middle step there. And anyways, that's something I might use sometimes as a tip. But yeah, anyways, or say for example I wanted to do 15% off, that would be 85% of the original value. And it's pretty easy. You just take the difference between the percentage with the 100, and that's the percentage of the original that I'll be paying. So it's sort of like instead of thinking how much I'm going to be saving, I'm thinking about how much am I going to be paying. I'm going to be paying 85% of the original bill. And to me, I think that makes a lot of sense. And so anyways, a 15% off check would be $106.25. And, you know, anyways, cool. So in the next example, I wanted to talk about how do we do this in our head? What are some tricks for doing percentages and shortcuts? But actually, a lot of the tricks reside on simple percentages, like for example 10%. And like looking back at the example of $125 and taking 10%, one thing about 10% is 10% is equal to 10 out of 100, which is obviously reduced to 1/10. And if I think about 1 out of 10, 1/10 is a very specific, very easy calculation to do because it's in base 10 and it works very well with our decimal system, right? Like if I take 10% of a number, that's going to be the exact same number, just with the decimal shifted one place. It's kind of like how 1% or 1/100th is 2 decimal places, right? When we're changing from decimal to percent, we always move it 2 spaces because that's what a percentage means. It means out of 100, which is divided by 100. But my point here is that when I divide by by 10 or take 10%, that's the same as taking the number and moving the decimal place once. And the 10% is a very useful reference point to know. So let's say I was trying to solve this next example. My goal is to do this in my head, to do it mentally instead of trying to rely on a calculator. But say, for example, you're at your restaurant and your bill is $125. Instead of saving money on your bill, let's say that you want to add tip to it instead. But obviously you could apply this math to savings as well and do savings math. But basically, let's start with 10% because that was kind of my point. 10% is a very easy thing to calculate. But let's say I'm being very cheap and I wanted to leave or there was horrible service or whatever, and I want to leave a 10% tip on this bill. And a lot of people would take out their phone or calculator. Well, nobody carries around a calculator, right? But they would do this math in their, on their cell phone calculator app. But there's a very simple way of calculating tip and even estimating it. Like say for example your bill is $123, you could just round it to an easier number and then use all of these tips from there. But basically 10% is very easy because if my bill is $125, 10% of 125 is just $12.50. You just move the decimal place once and you get a 10% tip. And then I would need to add that on to the original bill to come up with the new bill, which would be $137.50. And if you're not great with basic arithmetic, you could always just round that to say $13. Because if you're tipping, you might think to just round up a little bit. If you're trying to be more generous, or again, obviously a tip you can leave whatever you feel is right. But this is kind of an easy way of calculating a particular percentage. Well, actually, these days they often have the tip automatically, like you can just choose 10%, 15%, whatever, 20% in their menu options. But let's assume that we're actually dining at a restaurant with our friends, even though we are not allowed to do that right now. Anyways, so that's kind of my point, is we can do all this without a calculator, but also you can apply the idea of 10% to other percentages. Like let's say 20%. Well, I know that 10% is this much, so 20% should be exactly double that. So if I wanted to know, well, what's 20%? That's double of 10%, which would just be $25, right? Because once I know 10%, it's a good reference point or a reference percentage to figure out other percentages. And then if I wanted to do if I wanted to leave a 20% tip, I would just add that to the original bill, which would leave me with a final bill of $150 plus 20% tip. And anyways, it's a simple tactic for using 10%, or what we could say is move the decimal place and double it. That's your tip. And that's kind of the trick I'm getting at. Or 15% is another very common tip threshold, and I don't know why these percentages are used. It's just kind of social common thing. But let's say we wanted to figure out a 15% tip. Another thing is we could start with the 10% tip, which is $12.50, and if we wanted to do 5%, 5% would be exactly half of that. So basically, if I was thinking about 5% tip, that would be half of 10%, which is $6.25. And then if I add $6.25 to the 10% tip, that would give me a 15% tip. Sorry, I know my my math notation here is pretty horrible. Hopefully you can follow my logic. But that would be 1875 adding 10% plus 5%. And that would give me a 15% tip. And then I could add that to my bill, which would be, and again, like if you're estimating, you could just say call it 20 bucks, right? Or $19 and just round it a little bit to make your life easier as you choose. But if we're trying to be exact, that would be 145 minus 125, so 143.75, I believe. And anyways, we can calculate all sorts of different tip thresholds in our head using this trick. So the starting point is with 10%, and from there I can figure out 20%, 15% quite easily by these sort of tricks. That'll wrap it up for this video. We'll do a few more percentage examples in the next video, which will wrap up our lecture for this week.